Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture. This week, we will begin looking at some of the selections from the book Chicana Feminist Thought. And what you see in this collection is a collection of writings by Chicana Feminisms, mostly during the period of the Chicano movement. There are writings that challenge the machismo within the Chicano movement organizations. You'll also find and read about the tensions among women between loyalists versus feminists. Loyalists being those women who felt that feminism was a white woman's thing and that Chicana should just focus on the Chicano movement. And it also articulates Chicana women's issues, developing their own version of feminism. So there are two conferences that are mentioned in the readings for this week. One is the Denver Youth Conference that took place in 1969. This was organized by the Crusade for Justice, which was an organization of the Chicano movement that was situated here in Denver and was led by Corky Gonzalez. The purpose of this group was to create a cultural nationalist platform for the Chicano movement. And that's why they called this first conference in 1969, was to bring together Chicano youth from throughout the country to create a national movement. And as you'll see in the readings, many of the women from that time period who attended this conference remember this particular experience during the Chicana caucus, after they discussed a number of issues among the women. When they came back to report on what the resolutions were from the Chicana caucus to the bigger conference group, the statement was made. It was a consensus of the group that the Chicana woman does not want to be liberated. And so, as you'll see in some of the readings, many women still to this day recall this and how they felt about this particular statement being made. The second conference that you'll see talked about in these readings is the Women's Conference in Houston that took place in 1971. This conference was organized as a way to demonstrate that Chicana women did have issues with sexism and patriarchy that they wanted to address. So it was kind of a response to that first conference. The conference was organized by women from the Magnolia branch of the YWCA in Houston, Texas. This location and sponsorship of the conference became one of the sticking points of a group of women who decided to walk out of the conference, arguing against the dependence on a mainstream white women's organization. They argued the YWCA was a missionary white women's institution whose goal was to split the Chicano movement. So this was once again, sort of this tension between the loyalists and the feminists. Due to the much larger number of participants than what was expected, there were a number of organizational issues that arose, such as overcrowded conditions and a lack of available housing for participants. People complained about the kind of food that was being offered and so on. And so in the middle of the conference, there was this group of women who walked out, who also critiqued the conference as selfish, that it was selfish to be talking about gender issues when there were other issues like Chicanos in Vietnam and the farm workers movement. So there was this sort of division created among Chicana women during this conference that came out. One of the arguments were around cultural authenticity, where loyalists again argued that Chicana feminists and Chicana women organizing this conference were not real Chicanas. They were sellouts to the mainstream women's movement. Again, one of the arguments was about homegrown feminism versus Anglo feminism. The women who organized the conference pointed out that this particular YWCA branch was actually located and run by Chicana women in the Chicana neighborhood. And so they argued that it made sense for them to use this particular space. And there was also regional differences that appeared, where many of the Women who were loyalists and walked out were women who had come from California, versus the women in Texas who very much felt that it was important to organize as women. But there were a number of issues that were addressed during this conference by those women who decided to stay and participate. One of the standout workshops during the conference was the one about sexuality, where for the first time Chicanas were able to speak openly about sexual hangups within the Chicano community. The resolutions that were proposed put forth a wide-ranging agenda that included a shift in attitudes toward a more positive view of sexuality, the eradication of patriarchal values in relation to sexuality and the sexual double standard, a commitment to sex education, access to birth control and legal abortions, 24-hour childcare centers, and an end to the practice of sterilization and medical experimentation on Chicana women. Another important workshop was the one about religion, where the women also took on the Catholic Church and discussed ways the church could collaborate in revolutionary change, as well as pointing out the ways in which it was limiting to women's issues. Some of the participants actually included Chicana nuns who were becoming politicized through the liberation theology movement of that time period, where there were a number of people from within the Catholic Church that was starting to criticize the church from within and felt that the church had a duty to be part of the liberation and revolutionary movements that were happening at that time. Even though there was this discussion about a more liberal role of the church, and even though there were Chicana nuns there participating, the final resolution that was passed in that particular workshop called for a complete separation from the Catholic Church as an oppressive institution. So you can see there was still a wider debate around the role of the Catholic Church than the concluding resolution would suggest, right? So when you look at the selection for this week of different essays, you see the various Chicana feminist elements that we've talked about so far appearing in many of these writings. They acknowledge the long history of Mexican and Mexican-American women who have stood up for their rights, fought during the Mexican Revolution, or women in their own families who were strong women who in their everyday experiences challenged patriarchy and sexism. And this was, in particular, bringing up a lot of this historical examples, was a way to respond to the assumption that Chicana feminists were sellouts to the mainstream white culture for raising women's issues. They were trying to show that feminism wasn't only a white woman's thing, but that was part of Chicana history as well. They also situate Chicanas within a larger history of U.S. imperialism and colonization. They attempt to strike a balance between advocating women's issues and at the same time being supportive of Chicano men. So you can see in their essays that they're constantly trying to navigate that balance. They identify systemic forms of oppression, such as the welfare system and economic exploitation, and sort of how these systems function to impact Chicana women in particular. They're also critical of capitalist consumerism, and you see a number of critiques about middle-class Chicanas who are sort of, get caught up on the consumerist culture of the time and sort of being called out about that. You also see them talk about solidarity with other third world revolutionaries, such as Vietnamese women, because as you recall, the Vietnam War is going on at this time. But one of the things that you see throughout these essays at this time is heterosexist assumptions about family and relationships between men and women. You see a lot of the language being about the family, la raza family, as being sort of your mainstream nuclear family with a man and a woman and children. You also see them constantly talking about our men and our women, sort of relationships between men and women, and no real sort of acknowledgement, at least in these pieces at this earlier time, about, people who don't have heterosexual relationships, right? What was the role of lesbian women? That was something that wasn't openly talked about until later. We also see in these readings the number of issues that they are raising, issues such as around employment, right, and what kinds of jobs and what kind of pay Chicanas are experiencing in the 1970s, the need for childcare, inadequate housing. So there's a lot of issues around poverty, right, and sort of working class and poverty conditions that Chicana women experience. The experience of the double shift, meaning that for working Chicanas, not only are they having to work, at their employment, but when they come home, then they have their second shifts, taking care of the household, the children, and so on. They also raise issues around double standards around women's sexuality. There's the whole idea that women should be virgins and should be very conservative when it comes to their sexuality, whereas it's okay for men to be promiscuous and have various sexual relationships. They also raise issues around the limitations of gender roles in the home. So they are raising sort of that consciousness around the inequalities in terms of gender roles, of why can't men be the ones helping with the children and so on. And they were also very cognizant around reproductive justice issues such as birth control and abortions. But their particular concern was about having these reproductive options available to Chicanas from a different perspective than the mainstream women were fighting for. So they wanted Chicanas to have community control over birth control and abortions. And then finally, what I did was to sort of highlight some of the debates, right? The variety of ways in which Chicanas express their various ideas around feminism. Was pulling quotes from some of the different essays so you can see some of their differences. So in this first one by Enriqueta Longo Vasquez, she was very much involved in the women, especially in the movement, especially in New Mexico. The image there of El Grito del Norte is one of the newspapers that she was heavily involved with. And so you can see that her attitude was about being Chicanas first, right? Putting the Chicano movement first and the women's issues second. As she says, the Chicana must not choose white women's liberation. To be a Chicana primero, first, to stand by her people, will make her stronger for the struggle and endurance of her people. La familia de la raza needs her for the building of our nación de Aztlán. So it was very much sort of focused on what role women should have within the bigger Chicano movement. Whereas Elizabeth Martinez, we see her having a more intersectional kind of understanding of the experience of Chicana women, where she says her oppression by the forces of racism and imperialism is similar to that endured by our men. Oppression by sexism, however, is hers alone. So sort of making this distinction that there are commonalities in terms of between Chicana men and women in terms of the kind of exploitation and oppression they're experiencing, but that there's a particular experience that women have through sexism. Marta Cotera states, if feminism or a women's liberation movement continues its activities in this country, Chicanas seem ready to make certain it is a multicultural movement, especially in educational institutions and in the political and socioeconomic arena. So Marta Cotera took more of a position where Chicanas should be aware of what's happening in the women's liberation movement, should be involved in it to the extent of reminding the mainstream women's movement that not all women are the same and that they have to be open to talking about issues of race and how different women experience different things uniquely, right? So that there are different kinds of issues that affect white women differently than Chicanas. Francisca Flores takes more of a critical view of those of what we would call the loyalists, right? Of women who themselves are promoting this idea that the role of the Chicana should be within the women's within the Chicana family. The issue of birth control, abortions, information on sex, and the pill are considered white women's lib issues and should be rejected by Chicanas according to the Chicano philosophy that believes that the Chicana woman's place is in the home and that her role is that of a mother with a large family. Women who do not accept this philosophy are charged with betrayal of, quote, our culture and heritage, our culture hell. So she's, really being critical of, this idea that if you don't fulfill sort of the traditional expectations of Chicana women within the family, that you're somehow a sellout or a traitor to the culture. And here she's critiquing that idea. Finally, Velia Garcia states, we aren't oppressed by Chicanos, we're oppressed by a system that serves white power and depends upon a white majority for its survival and perpetuation. So in her piece, you really see more of this systemic critique around white supremacy and white racist oppression, which is something that sometimes we assume is a more relatively recent critique. But as we see in some of these writings, Chicanas were talking about white supremacy and white privilege in the 1970s and realizing that there was a bigger systemic issue around race that was at play. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts on these readings in the discussion post. Have a good week.